Hello, my love. Welcome to Stories with Oge Pleasure. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Please share the video with friends and loved ones. Also turn on the notifications to get notified for next stories. Sit back, let's dive into the story. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Elizabeth and Daniel's modest two-bedroom apartment in Lagos. Elizabeth sat at the dining table, absently staring at her untouched breakfast. A plate of fried plantains, eggs, and bread sat before her, the aroma wafting through the air. But her appetite was nowhere to be found. Across from her, Daniel sipped his tea, his eyes filled with quiet concern. They had shared 6 years of marriage, but the weight of societal expectations hung heavy in the air, threatening to choke the easy companionship they once shared. "Lizzie," Daniel began, his voice gentle, "you've barely touched your food. Are you okay?" Elizabeth snapped out of her reverie, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "I know things have been tough, but we'll get through this together." Elizabeth looked at him, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him, but the pressure to have a child, something so natural and expected, was slowly breaking her spirit. In their Nigerian community, marriage without children was almost seen as incomplete. For years, Elizabeth had smiled through the questions and comments, but lately, they had become harder to ignore. "Elizabeth, when will we hear the cry of a baby in your home?" An elderly woman from their church had asked a few weeks ago, her tone both curious and judgmental. The remarks were never meant to be malicious, but they were daggers all the same, reopening wounds Elizabeth tried to heal in private. At church, the pastor often preached about the blessings of children, quoting scriptures that spoke of the fruit of the womb. Elizabeth avoided eye contact during those sermons, her head bowed in silent prayer for a miracle. Even walking through the streets, Elizabeth couldn't escape the sight of mothers carrying babies on their backs or toddlers running around. It was as if the universe was mocking her. The breaking point came during a visit to Daniel's parents' home in Enugu. His mother had been vocal about their childlessness from the beginning. As they sat in the family's spacious sitting room, with its brown leather sofas and a large portrait of Daniel's late father, the tension was palpable. "Elizabeth," Mama began, her tone icy yet polite, "it's been 6 years now. What is the problem?" Elizabeth stiffened, her heart racing. She glanced at Daniel, hoping he would intervene, but he looked away, his jaw clenched. "Mama, we're trying," Elizabeth said softly, her voice trembling. "Trying?" Mama scoffed. "Do you think marriage is only for enjoyment? Children are the crown of a marriage. Or do you want to deny my son his legacy?" "Mama, that's enough," Daniel finally said, his voice firm but strained. "No, it's not enough," Mama retorted, her voice rising. "You are my only son, Daniel. You know what people are saying? They're calling me a barren woman's mother-in-law. Do you know the shame I feel?" Elizabeth's cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that this wasn't her fault, but the words wouldn't come. Daniel stood abruptly. "We didn't come here to be insulted, Mama. Let's go, Lizzie." As they walked out, Elizabeth could hear Mama muttering, "If she can't give you a child, maybe it's time to consider another option." The drive back to Lagos was silent. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Elizabeth stared out the window, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. Elizabeth turned to him, surprised. For what? For not defending you earlier. For putting you through this. It's not your fault, Elizabeth whispered, though deep down, she wondered if she was the problem. A few days later, during a visit from her friend, Amaka, the topic came up again. Amaka, a bubbly and outspoken woman, didn't mince her words. Lizzie, you need to see a doctor, she said bluntly. This isn't the time to be shy or proud. Do you know how many people have had babies through medical help? Elizabeth sighed. Daniel and I have talked about it, but I don't know, it feels so clinical. Clinical or not, do you want to keep enduring these insults? My sister's friend had twins last year after seeing this fertility doctor in Lagos. His name is Dr. Phil. He's very good. That evening, Elizabeth brought it up with Daniel, and to her surprise, he agreed without hesitation. We'll do whatever it takes, Daniel said, determination in his eyes. The clinic was located in a quiet area of Victoria Island. It was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside, with its polished floors and cool, air-conditioned waiting room. Dr. Phil greeted them warmly, his calm demeanor instantly putting them at ease. He listened intently as they explained their struggles, nodding thoughtfully. Let's start with some tests, he suggested. We'll figure this out together. As they left the clinic, Daniel seemed lighter, hopeful even. But Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was just beginning, and it would test them in ways they could never imagine. It had been a week since Elizabeth and Daniel visited Dr. Phil's clinic for their initial consultation. Both had undergone a series of tests, and now they sat together in Dr. Phil's office, waiting for the results. Dr. Phil, the handsome, brown-skinned Nigerian doctor with low-cut hair and a well-groomed beard, walked in with a folder. His calm demeanor instantly filled the room with a sense of professionalism. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Ease, Dr. Phil greeted warmly. Good afternoon, Doctor, Daniel responded, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. Elizabeth gave a polite nod, her fingers tightly interlocked on her lap. Dr. Phil took a seat and adjusted his glasses. I've reviewed your tests and I have good news. Both of you are in excellent health. There is no medical reason preventing you from having children. For a moment, there was silence. Daniel's expression shifted from relief to confusion. So, we're fine? Daniel asked, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, Dr. Phil confirmed with a reassuring smile. Sometimes, the issue isn't physical but psychological or emotional. Stress, societal pressure, or even timing can play a role. I'd recommend relaxing, focusing on your relationship, and letting nature take its course. Elizabeth forced a smile, but deep down, she felt a pang of frustration. If there was nothing wrong, why couldn't she conceive? She wanted to cry, but she held herself together, not wanting to seem weak in front of Daniel or the doctor. Dr. Phil continued, if you'd like, I can prescribe some supplements to enhance fertility, but it's not really necessary. Yes, doctor, let's try that, Daniel replied quickly. We'll do anything. Elizabeth nodded in agreement, but her mind was elsewhere. Over the following weeks, Elizabeth found herself making regular visits to Dr. Phil's clinic. While Daniel was busy with work, Elizabeth often went alone. Each time, Dr. Phil welcomed her with warmth and professionalism, always ready to answer her questions and reassure her. You seem tense, Mrs. Ease, Dr. Phil remarked during one appointment. Elizabeth sighed. It's hard not to be, doctor. Everywhere I go, people remind me of what I don't have. Dr. Phil leaned forward, his voice soft. I understand. It's not easy, but you're not alone. You and your husband will get through this. You're stronger than you think. His words, coupled with his kind eyes and gentle tone, made Elizabeth feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She began to trust him, confiding in him more than she ever thought she would. Meanwhile, Daniel was dealing with his own challenges. At work, his colleagues often joked about fatherhood, not knowing the pain their words caused him. Daniel, you better hurry up and give us small Daniels and Daniela's, one colleague teased during a lunch break. Daniel forced a laugh, but inside, he felt the sting of their words. He didn't know how to explain the emotional toll the situation was taking on him. At home, he tried to stay strong for Elizabeth. He would hold her at night, whispering reassurances, even when doubt began creeping into his own heart. As the weeks turned into months, Elizabeth's visits to Dr. Phil became more frequent. Their conversations extended beyond medical advice to personal matters. "You have such a positive outlook on life," Elizabeth remarked one day, smiling at Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil chuckled. "Well, life has its challenges, but I believe in focusing on the good. It's what keeps me going." Elizabeth admired his perspective, and slowly, she began looking forward to their conversations. She didn't realize that what started as professional comfort was beginning to evolve into something more. At home, Daniel noticed the change in Elizabeth. She seemed distracted, her smiles less frequent. "Lizzie, is everything okay?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat in the living room. Elizabeth hesitated. "I'm fine, Daniel. Just tired." Daniel frowned, but decided not to push. He assumed the pressure of their situation was wearing her down. Unbeknownst to him, Elizabeth's heart was in turmoil. She felt guilty for the growing bond she shared with Dr. Phil, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop seeing him. One day, during an appointment, Dr. Phil placed a comforting hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. The gesture was innocent, but the spark it ignited was undeniable. Elizabeth felt her heart race, and for a brief moment, she forgot about Daniel, about her marriage, about everything. "Elizabeth," Dr. Phil said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you're an incredible woman. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." His words lingered in her mind long after she left the clinic. That night, as she lay beside Daniel, she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. Daniel, ever the observant husband, began noticing small changes. Elizabeth's frequent trips to the clinic, her sudden cheerfulness after seeing Dr. Phil, and her growing emotional distance didn't escape him. One day, while cleaning their bedroom, he found a receipt from the clinic tucked in Elizabeth's bag. The date didn't match the appointments he remembered. "Why didn't she tell me about this one?" Daniel wondered, his sharp eyes narrowing in suspicion. Though he brushed it off, a seed of doubt had been planted. Elizabeth stood at the window, staring into the night sky. She felt torn between her loyalty to Daniel and the undeniable connection she felt with Dr. Phil. She didn't know what the future held, but deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. Daniel watched her from the doorway, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. He loved her more than anything, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. "Lizzie," he called softly. She turned to him, her radiant face lit by the moonlight. "Yes, Daniels. Whatever it is, we'll get through it. Together," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Elizabeth nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She wasn't sure how long she could keep her secrets buried. The late afternoon sun cast its golden glow over the Lagos skyline as Elizabeth sat in her living room, staring blankly at the wall. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, confusion, and a growing sense of attachment she couldn't explain. Dr. Phil's comforting words and gestures replayed in her mind. She had gone to him seeking answers about her fertility, but found something else, a sense of validation, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. But then there was Daniel, her husband, her rock, the man who had stood by her through every storm. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying him, even if nothing physical had happened yet. "Why am I feeling this way?" she whispered to herself, tears brimming in her eyes. Meanwhile, Daniel's unease was growing. He noticed Elizabeth's demeanor shifting, her distracted nature, her sudden cheerfulness after clinic visits, and her increasing reluctance to talk about her emotions. One evening, as Elizabeth prepared dinner, Daniel decided to confront her gently. "Lizzie," he began, his voice steady but laced with concern, "you've been seeing Dr. Phil more often these days. Is everything okay?" Elizabeth froze for a moment, the sound of vegetables sizzling in the pan filling the silence. She quickly composed herself and turned to him with a forced smile. "Yes, Daniel. He's just been supportive, that's all. You know how hard this has been for me." Daniel nodded, but didn't press further. He wanted to trust her, but the seed of doubt planted earlier was starting to grow. On her next visit to Dr. Phil's clinic, Elizabeth found herself lingering after her appointment. The conversation drifted from her fertility treatment to more personal topics. "You know," Dr. Phil said with a smile, "you're one of the strongest women I've met. Your resilience is inspiring." Elizabeth blushed, her dimples deepening as she smiled. "Thank you, doctor. That means a lot." "Call me Phil," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. The silence in the car on their way home from Dr. Phil's clinic was deafening. Elizabeth fidgeted with her fingers, stealing glances at Daniel, whose sharp eyes were fixed on the road ahead. His broad shoulders looked even more tense than usual, and his jaw was clenched. The unease in the air was suffocating. Elizabeth knew Daniel was suspicious, but she wasn't ready to admit to herself, let alone him, the emotional entanglement growing between her and Dr. Phil. Once home, Elizabeth excused herself to the bedroom, claiming fatigue. She sat at the edge of their bed, her mind replaying Daniel's pointed questions and Dr. Phil's increasingly personal comments. She whispered to herself, "What am I doing?" Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was a text from Dr. Phil. "Just wanted to check on you. Hope you're okay after today." Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart racing. She typed out a response, hesitated, then deleted it. She placed the phone face down, but the guilt gnawed at her. Daniel was in the living room, pacing back and forth. His mind was racing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He decided he needed to know more about this Dr. Phil. The next morning, while Elizabeth was in the shower, Daniel carefully went through her phone. He wasn't proud of this invasion of privacy, but his suspicions had consumed him. He found multiple messages between Elizabeth and Dr. Phil. Most of them seemed professional, but a few stood out, messages like, "You can talk to me anytime, Elizabeth. I'm here for you. You're a strong woman. Don't forget that." Daniel's chest tightened. While there was nothing overtly romantic, the tone felt too personal for his comfort. That weekend, Daniel's mother, Mama Chinyere, decided to visit. She was a traditional Igbo woman who had never hidden her disapproval of Elizabeth's inability to conceive. As the family sat in the living room, Mama Chinyere began her usual tirade. "Daniel, my son, you know how important it is to have children to carry on the family name. Time is not on your side." She turned to Elizabeth, her sharp eyes piercing. "Elizabeth, what exactly is the problem? Have you seen the right doctors?" Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. "Mama, we've been trying everything. It's in God's hands." Mama Chinyere scoffed. "God helps those who help themselves. Maybe you're not praying enough or doing what you should as a wife." Daniel cut in, his tone sharp. "Mama, that's enough. Elizabeth is doing her best." But Elizabeth had already retreated into silence, her dimples faint as she forced a smile. The confrontation left her feeling more isolated than ever. Elizabeth found herself at the clinic again the following Monday. She didn't tell Daniel this time, knowing it would only add to his suspicions. Dr. Phil greeted her warmly, his handsome face lighting up as she walked in. "Elizabeth, it's always good to see you," he said, his voice tinged with something more than professionalism. As they discussed her treatment, Dr. Phil leaned forward. "You know, Elizabeth, you're not alone in this. I admire your strength. It's rare to meet someone like you." Elizabeth felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you, Phil," she said softly, her dimples showing briefly. Before she left, Dr. Phil touched her arm lightly. "If you ever need to talk about anything, my door is always open." Elizabeth nodded, but as she walked to her car, she felt a pang of guilt so strong it brought tears to her eyes. That evening, Daniel could no longer hold back. After dinner, he looked at Elizabeth, his sharp eyes scanning her face for any sign of deception. "Lizzie, we need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elizabeth set down her glass of water, her radiant skin glowing under the dining room light. "What is it, Daniel?" "I went through your phone," he admitted. "I saw the messages between you and Dr. Phil." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Daniel, how could you invade my privacy like that? How could you keep things from me?" Daniel countered, his voice rising. "What's going on between you and him?" "Nothing," Elizabeth shouted, tears streaming down her face. He's been supportive, that's all. I've been feeling so lost, and he listens to me in a way. She trailed off, realizing she had said too much. In a way I don't. Daniel asked, his voice breaking. Elizabeth stood up, her hands trembling. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Daniel. Your mother, your family, everyone expects me to fix this, as if I'm the only one responsible for us not having children. Daniel's broad shoulders slumped. Lizzie, I've never blamed you. But I can't help feeling like I'm losing you. Elizabeth didn't respond. The weight of her secrets and the strain on their marriage felt unbearable. At his clinic, Dr. Phil sat at his desk, deep in thought. He knew he was crossing professional boundaries with Elizabeth, but he couldn't help himself. There was something about her that drew him in. He picked up his phone and typed a message. Elizabeth, I hope you're doing okay. Remember, I'm here for you. As he sent the text, a small smile played on his lips. He knew he was treading dangerous waters, but he wasn't ready to let go of whatever connection they had. Days after Daniel's confrontation, Elizabeth struggled to maintain her composure. She could feel Daniel watching her every move, his sharp eyes silently accusing her. Her guilt over her relationship with Dr. Phil weighed heavily, but she couldn't bring herself to cut ties completely. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. It was another message from Dr. Phil. I hope today wasn't too stressful. You're always on my mind. Elizabeth stared at the message for a moment before replying. Thank you, Phil. It means a lot. As soon as she sent the text, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she saw Daniel standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders framed against the dim light from the hallway. Who are you texting? He asked, his tone calm but piercing. Just a friend, Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Is it him? Elizabeth looked away, avoiding his gaze. Daniel's decision to investigate further. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of Dr. Phil and the growing distance between him and Elizabeth. He decided he needed answers, even if it meant confronting Dr. Phil directly. The next day, Daniel took time off work and headed to Dr. Phil's clinic. He arrived unannounced, his tall frame towering over the receptionist's desk. I need to speak with Dr. Phil, he said firmly. Do you have an appointment? The receptionist asked. No, but he'll want to see me, Daniel replied, his voice brooking no argument. After a brief exchange, Daniel was led to Dr. Phil's office. The doctor greeted him with a warm smile that quickly faded when he saw the intensity in Daniel's sharp eyes. Inside the clinic office, the tension was palpable. Dr. Phil, dressed impeccably in his white coat, leaned against his desk, his well-groomed beard framing his carefully neutral expression. To what do I owe this visit, Mr. Daniel? Dr. Phil asked. Daniel crossed his arms, his broad shoulders adding to his imposing presence. I've come to talk about my wife. Dr. Phil raised an eyebrow. Elizabeth? Is something wrong? You tell me, Daniel shot back. You've been spending a lot of time with her, haven't you? Dr. Phil hesitated, then smiled politely. Elizabeth is my patient. I care about her well-being, as I do with all my patients. Save the professionalism, Daniel snapped. I've seen the messages. Dr. Phil's expression darkened slightly. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I assure you, my intentions toward Elizabeth are nothing but honorable. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. I don't trust you, and I won't let anyone come between me and my wife. Dr. Phil held his ground, his tone calm but defensive. Perhaps this is a conversation you should have with Elizabeth. When Daniel returned home, he found Elizabeth sitting in the kitchen, her radiant skin glowing under the warm light. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his gaze. Daniel, where have you been? She asked nervously. I went to see him, Daniel replied bluntly. Elizabeth's heart sank. What did you do? I needed to look him in the eye and make sure he knows to stay away from you, Daniel said. Elizabeth's dimples appeared faintly as she tried to muster a reassuring smile. Daniel, you're overreacting. Phil hasn't done anything wrong. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, making Elizabeth flinch. Don't defend him, Elizabeth. I see what's happening, even if you won't admit it. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face. I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean for things to get so complicated. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Dr. Phil couldn't shake the confrontation with Daniel. Instead of feeling deterred, he felt emboldened. He convinced himself that Elizabeth deserved someone who truly understood her struggles. He sent another message. I hope you're okay. Remember, I'm always here for you. Elizabeth read the message late that night, her emotions in turmoil. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but couldn't bring herself to cut Dr. Phil off. Elizabeth's guilt and the pressure from Daniel's suspicions began to take a toll on her mental health. One evening, she broke down in tears in their bedroom. Daniel walked in, alarmed. Elizabeth, what's wrong? I can't take this anymore, Daniel, she sobbed. The pressure, the expectations, the guilt. I feel like I'm drowning. Daniel sat beside her, his broad shoulders slumping. Lizzie, I'm sorry if I've added to your stress, but I need to know the truth. Are you in love with him? Elizabeth shook her head vehemently. No, Daniel. I love you. But Phil, he listens to me in a way I've needed. Daniel's sharp eyes softened slightly, but the pain in them was evident. At the clinic, Dr. Phil began to push boundaries further. He suggested more frequent checkups for Elizabeth and used these sessions to build a stronger emotional connection. You're too hard on yourself, Elizabeth, he said during one appointment. You need someone who sees you for the incredible woman you are. Elizabeth smiled faintly, her dimples appearing, but her guilt only deepened. One evening, as Elizabeth prepared dinner, Daniel found a new receipt from the clinic. This one was for an unscheduled appointment. He confronted her in the kitchen. Elizabeth, why are you still seeing him without telling me? Elizabeth stammered. I needed someone to talk to. Daniel's anger flared. I'm your husband, Elizabeth. Why can't you talk to me? Elizabeth broke down, her radiant skin shining with tears. Because I'm ashamed. I feel like I've failed you, Daniel. Daniel decided to dig deeper into Dr. Phil's intentions. He reached out to an old friend who worked in the same medical circle. The friend revealed unsettling information about Dr. Phil's history with female patients, hinting at inappropriate behavior. Armed with this new information, Daniel felt a renewed determination to protect his marriage and expose Dr. Phil's true nature. Elizabeth's life felt like it was unraveling. Daniel's increasing suspicions, coupled with her guilt and the emotional entanglement with Dr. Phil, left her feeling trapped. At work, she struggled to focus, and at home, she avoided Daniel's piercing gaze. One evening, as she sat in the living room, her phone buzzed with another message from Dr. Phil. You looked beautiful today. Remember, I'm here for you. Elizabeth hesitated but replied. Thank you, Phil. You're the only one who understands me. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel had installed spyware on her phone. He received a notification of her exchange with Dr. Phil and felt his anger boil over. Daniel confronts his friend about Dr. Phil's past. Determined to dig deeper into Dr. Phil's history, Daniel visited his friend Chinidu, who worked in the same medical circle. They met at a quiet cafe in Lagos, where Chinidu, a reserved man in his late 30s, hesitated to speak at first. Chinidu, I need the truth, Daniel said, his deep voice firm. What do you know about Dr. Phil? Chinidu sighed. Phil is brilliant, no doubt, but there have been whispers. Complaints from female patients. Nothing official, but enough to make people wary. Daniel clenched his fists. Why didn't anyone report him? Most of these women were too scared to come forward, Chinidu replied. And Phil has a way of charming people. But if you're looking for proof, you'll need more than rumors. Daniel nodded grimly. I'll find it. Dr. Phil, feeling emboldened by Elizabeth's continued responses, decided to push the boundaries further. During one of her clinic visits, he suggested they meet outside of work. You deserve to relax, Elizabeth, he said, his voice warm. Why don't we grab dinner sometime? As friends, Elizabeth hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea, Phil. He leaned closer, his well-groomed beard catching the light. You need someone to talk to, and I'm here for you. No strings attached. Elizabeth, overwhelmed by his persistence, reluctantly agreed. Late one night, Daniel sat in his study, scrolling through Elizabeth's phone records. His heart sank when he saw the frequency of her messages and calls to Dr. Phil. He decided to follow her the next day. Elizabeth and Dr. Phil met at a quiet restaurant in Lagos. She dressed modestly, her radiant skin glowing under the warm lights. Phil, in a crisp shirt, leaned forward, his eyes focused on her as they talked. "I don't know what to do anymore, Phil," Elizabeth admitted, her voice shaky. "Trust me," Phil said softly, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Outside, Daniel sat in his car, watching through the window. His chest tightened as he saw Dr. Phil's hand on Elizabeth's. When Elizabeth returned home, Daniel was waiting for her. His sharp eyes burned with anger. "Where were you?" he asked coldly. "Out with a friend," Elizabeth replied, avoiding his gaze. "Don't lie to me, Elizabeth. I saw you with him." Elizabeth froze, her dimples faint as she tried to smile through the tension. "Daniel, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "Because it looks like you're falling for him." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to get this far." After the explosive confrontation, Elizabeth resolved to end her connection with Dr. Phil. She called him the next morning. "Phil, we can't keep doing this," she said. "I need to focus on my marriage." Phil's voice was calm but firm. "Elizabeth, are you sure about this?" "I only want what's best for you." "I'm sure," she replied. "Goodbye, Phil." Dr. Phil, unable to accept Elizabeth's decision, became more aggressive. He sent her a series of messages, pleading with her to reconsider. When she didn't respond, he began to escalate. One evening, Daniel answered a knock at their door to find an anonymous package. Inside were printed copies of Elizabeth's text messages with Dr. Phil, along with a note. "You deserve to know the truth." Daniel's face darkened as he read the messages. When Elizabeth came home, Daniel confronted her with the messages. "Explain this," he said, throwing the papers on the table. Elizabeth's heart sank as she saw the messages. "Daniel, I can explain." "Enough with the lies, Elizabeth," Daniel roared. "You've been betraying me with that man." Elizabeth broke down in tears. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I never meant to hurt you." The argument escalated, with Daniel eventually telling Elizabeth to leave the house. "I can't do this anymore, Elizabeth," he said. "You need to go." Elizabeth packed a bag and left, tears streaming down her face as she walked out of the home they had built together. Elizabeth sought refuge with a friend, but Dr. Phil reached out again. This time, his tone was different, demanding and controlling. "You can't just cut me off, Elizabeth," he said during a phone call. "You owe me." Realizing the extent of Phil's manipulation, Elizabeth began to see him in a new light. Meanwhile, Daniel channeled his anger into action. Using the information Chinedu had provided, he began gathering evidence of Dr. Phil's misconduct. He contacted former patients and encouraged them to come forward. Elizabeth spent her days at her friend's house, haunted by the echoes of her confrontation with Daniel. She replayed his words in her mind. "You've betrayed me, Elizabeth. I can't trust you anymore." Her friend, Amaka, a lively woman in her early 30s, tried to console her. "Elizabeth, you need to tell Daniel everything. Keeping secrets is only making it worse." Elizabeth sighed, her dimples faintly visible even in her sadness. "I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, Amaka. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness." Meanwhile, Daniel's anger had transformed into a quiet, cold determination. Armed with the information from Chinedu and the damning evidence of Dr. Phil's predatory behavior, he decided to confront him on his own turf. Late one evening, Daniel visited Dr. Phil's clinic. The receptionist hesitated before letting him in. "Dr. Phil is busy," she stammered, but Daniel's piercing gaze silenced her objections. When Daniel entered Dr. Phil's office, the air crackled with tension. "Daniel," Dr. Phil said smoothly, his well-groomed beard catching the light. "This is unexpected." Daniel stepped closer, his broad shoulders looming. "Cut the pretense, Phil. I know everything. About you, about Elizabeth, and about the other women you've hurt." Dr. Phil's expression faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel slammed a folder onto the desk. Inside were printed accounts from former patients and screenshots of Elizabeth's messages. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are." At a mockus insistence, Elizabeth decided to reach out to Daniel. She called him late one evening, her voice trembling. "Daniel, can we talk?" she asked. "There's nothing to talk about," Daniel replied coldly. "Please," Elizabeth pleaded, her tears evident in her voice. "I made mistakes, but I love you, Daniel. I want to fix this." Daniel hesitated before responding. "Meet me tomorrow at the house. We'll talk then." The next day, Elizabeth arrived at their home, her heart pounding. The living room felt colder, emptier than it ever had. Daniel stood by the window, his posture stiff and unyielding. "I'm here," Elizabeth said softly. Daniel turned to face her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Why, Elizabeth? Why did you do it?" Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain. "I felt lost, Daniel. The years without children, the pressure from everyone. I wasn't thinking straight. And you thought the solution was to betray me with him?" Daniel's voice was filled with pain. Elizabeth sobbed. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I was weak, and I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make it right." Daniel shook his head. "Sorry doesn't erase what you've done, Elizabeth. I don't know if we can ever come back from this." Dr. Phil, realizing his reputation was on the line, began to panic. He tried to contact Elizabeth, leaving voicemail after voicemail. "Elizabeth, don't let Daniel ruin us," his messages said. "We can still be together." Elizabeth, however, ignored him, finally seeing him for the manipulative man he was. Daniel decided to take the next step in his plan. With the help of Chinidu and a journalist friend, he compiled a detailed exposé on Dr. Phil's unethical behavior. The article, titled "The Dark Secrets of a Trusted Doctor," went viral within days. Former patients began coming forward, sharing their experiences. Dr. Phil's clinic faced immediate backlash. Protests erupted outside, with people demanding justice. Back at her friend's house, Elizabeth began to feel the weight of her actions in a new way. Gossip spread quickly, and people in the community started whispering about her involvement with Dr. Phil. One day, while shopping in a local market, Elizabeth overheard a group of women talking. "Did you hear about that woman who cheated on her husband with her doctor?" one of them said. "She's shameless," another added. Elizabeth hurried away, her head down, tears streaming down her face. A glimmer of hope. Despite everything, Daniel found himself conflicted. As much as he was hurt by Elizabeth's betrayal, he couldn't deny the love they once shared. One evening, he sat in their empty home, looking at old photos of happier times. Memories of their laughter, their dreams, and their love flooded his mind. He picked up his phone and called her. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "can we meet?" It had been days since Elizabeth last heard from Daniel after their tense confrontation. She sat alone in a maucus spare room, staring at her phone. Her radiant skin seemed dull, and her usual cheerful dimples were absent. She mustered her courage and sent Daniel a message. "I know I've hurt you, Daniel, but I need to talk to you. Please, one last chance to explain." To her surprise, Daniel replied shortly after, "Meet me at the house tomorrow evening." Elizabeth's heart raced. This was her chance to lay everything bare. That night, Daniel sat alone in their living room. The weight of the past weeks pressed heavily on his broad shoulders. He looked at their wedding photo hanging on the wall, Elizabeth's dimples lighting up her face, his eyes filled with hope and love. How did it all go so wrong? He thought. Years of societal pressure and yearning for a child had taken a toll on their marriage. He struggled to decide if forgiveness was even possible. The next evening, Elizabeth arrived at their home. She hesitated at the door, clutching a small notebook filled with her thoughts. When Daniel opened the door, his expression was unreadable. His sharp eyes met hers briefly before he stepped aside to let her in. They sat across from each other in the living room. The silence was deafening. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Elizabeth began, her voice trembling. "I know I've said it before, but I mean it with every fiber of my being." Daniel leaned back, his arms crossed. "Why, Elizabeth? Was I not enough? Was our love not enough? Elizabeth's tears flowed freely now. You were more than enough, Daniel. I let fear and loneliness consume me. I wasn't strong, and I made a terrible mistake. You didn't just betray me, Daniel said, his voice breaking. You brought another man into our lives when we were supposed to be building a family together. Elizabeth sobbed harder. I thought if I gave us a child, everything would be okay. But I was wrong. I destroyed the very thing I was trying to save. While Elizabeth and Daniel grappled with their relationship, Dr. Phil faced the consequences of his actions. The exposé Daniel orchestrated had gone viral, and his once flourishing career was in ruins. Patients filed lawsuits, and authorities launched investigations into his unethical practices. Protesters gathered outside his clinic daily, demanding justice. One evening, Dr. Phil sat in his empty office, staring at a cease and desist order from the medical board. His arrogance had been his downfall, and now he was utterly alone. Elizabeth knew her journey to regain Daniel's trust would be long and difficult. She decided to focus on rebuilding herself first. She sought therapy, hoping to understand the insecurities and societal pressures that had driven her actions. She also began volunteering at a local orphanage, finding solace in helping children who had no one else. One day, while handing out food at the orphanage, Elizabeth noticed a young girl with bright eyes and a shy smile. For a moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps love and family could take different forms. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled with his feelings. As hurt as he was, he couldn't deny that he still loved Elizabeth. One evening, while visiting his brother, Chinidu, they had a candid conversation. Do you still love her? Chinidu asked bluntly. Daniel hesitated. I don't know. I'm angry, betrayed, but yes, I think I do. Then maybe forgiveness isn't about her, Chinidu said. Maybe it's about finding peace for yourself. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip about Elizabeth and Daniel's situation. At church, at the market, and among friends, people speculated about whether they'd reconcile. Weeks later, Daniel and Elizabeth sat together in a counselor's office. The mediator, an older woman with a kind face, encouraged them to speak openly. I want to rebuild trust, Elizabeth said. Even if it takes the rest of my life. Daniel nodded slowly. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, but I'm willing to try for both of us. Months passed, and while their relationship was far from healed, Daniel and Elizabeth began finding small moments of peace. One evening, Daniel came home to find Elizabeth sitting at the dining table, reading a book about adoption. What's this? He asked, his tone curious but not accusatory. Elizabeth looked up, her dimples faintly showing. It's just an idea, she said softly. Something to think about for the future. Daniel nodded, sitting beside her. Let's think about it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, it felt like they were on the same path. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like. Also, don't forget to leave a comment and share the video to someone that might be interested.